Chapter. The ball is called for 9. The card on the mantelpiece said 8 o'clock for 8:30, dancing at 9, and Dorothea Cavendish Price had written it herself in her good copperplate hand the week before, in the same ink she used for Christmas lists and household accounts. Helen Prout found her at 8:20. The dressing room was off the main bedroom on the first floor, south-facing, and even with the window open it held the day's heat like a bread oven. Helen had come to fetch the white evening gloves, which Mrs. Cavendish Price had left on the chair by the glass, and she almost walked into her mistress on the floor before she saw her. She was lying partly on her side, one arm outstretched toward the dressing-table leg, the other folded beneath her. Her hair was still pinned. She was dressed. The back hook of her gown was undone, the one Helen was supposed to fasten. Helen said her name. She said it again, louder. She crouched and put her hand on the bare shoulder and felt the warmth of it and thought, for one very long moment, that everything would be all right. She called out from the doorway into the corridor. A passing footman, young from the village, stopped dead. She told him to fetch Dr. Samuels at once, that Mrs. Cavendish Price had fainted, that he was to be quick and not to make a fuss. The footman ran. Downstairs guests were arriving, tyres on gravel, voices in the hall, the band warming up somewhere behind the green baize door that separated the house from the ballroom wing. Sir Edmund was at the bottom of the stairs, shaking hands with the Vanes, and saying something about the extraordinary warmth for November. His colour was high, and he was sweating a little inside his white tie. He looked pleased with himself, and with the evening, and with the particular way the hall lights caught the flowers on the half-landing. He did not know yet. Dr. Samuels came from the billiards-room, where he had been standing with a whisky and soda. He was 51, and had been Dorothea Cavendish Price's doctor for 14 years. And he did not hurry so much as move quickly and without drama, which was a different thing. He was up the stairs, and in the dressing-room inside 2 minutes. Helen stood in the doorway. She watched him kneel. She watched him take the wrist. His face did not change the way she expected it to change. He sat back on his heels and was still for a moment. He said, "How long has she been here?" Helen did not know. She had last seen Mrs. Cavendish Price at 7, when she had done her hair, and helped with the necklace, and gone away to press the gloves, which had a crease in the left one that wanted attention. Samuel said, "Fetch Sir Edmund, quietly." Helen went down the back stairs. She found Perkins, the butler, and told him, and Perkins went to Sir Edmund at the foot of the main staircase, and bent to speak in his ear, and Helen, watching from the passage door, saw the colour leave Sir Edmund's face as though it had been turned off. She did not watch the rest of it. She went to the back of the house and stood by the kitchen garden door, in the warm, peculiar November air, and listened to the band, playing something bright and danceable in the ballroom, and to the moment a few minutes later when it stopped. The verdict, when Dr. Samuels gave it, was heart failure aggravated by the heat. Dorothea Cavendish Price had not been well in some time, he said, and the effort of preparation, the warmth of the room, the excitement of the evening, had been too much for her. He said it gently and without hesitation. He had been saying it, or some version of it, for many years. The guests were told in the hall. The cars were called. People left in groups, hushed, passing the flower arrangements on the half-landing, not quite looking at the stairs. Robert Cavendish Price arrived from his room at 9:15, dressed, his hair damp from a quick wash, asking what the noise was. Someone told him. He stood quite still for a long moment, and then he sat down heavily on the hall settle. And the woman nearest him, who was Mrs. Vane from Charlbury, put her hand on his arm, and he did not move it away. Outside, the warm November night continued. It was the 3rd week of the heat wave. The lawn smelled of dry grass and the last roses of the year, and somewhere beyond the stable block a dog barked twice and was quiet. Chapter. Natural causes. By 10 o'clock, Farnley Court was very nearly empty of guests. A few had stayed. The Vaneys, who were old friends and lived only 3 miles away. Constance Alford, who was a house guest and had nowhere to go. The Hartleys, an elderly couple who had no car and were waiting for their son. The band had gone. The caterers were quiet in the kitchens, uncertain whether to begin clearing. Sir Edmund sat in the library with Robert and with Dr. Samuels. The door was closed. Constance Alford sat in the drawing-room with Mrs. Vane, who was small and fair and worried, and with Miss Marple, who was knitting something pale blue and saying very little. Patricia Vane had gone to see about tea, which was taking longer than it should have. Constance Alford was 57 and wore her grief with the kind of composure that looks, at first glance, like shock. She said twice that it was dreadful, that Dorothea had seemed perfectly well at dinner, that the heat was really extraordinary for the time of year. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she did not cry. Mrs. Vane cried briefly into a handkerchief. She and Dorothea had known each other for 20 years, through the Women's Institute and the Hunt Committee, and 2 floods and a fire at the rectory, Miss Marple said, when there was a pause. Had Mrs. Cavendish Price been troubled with her heart for long? Some years, Constance said. She mentioned it occasionally. She didn't like to dwell on it. She paused. That was Dorothea entirely. She thought if you didn't speak of a thing it couldn't touch you. Miss Marple said, "Dear me," in a mild way, and went on with the knitting. Patricia came back with tea, and they drank it, and gradually the room settled into the particular quiet of a house where something bad has happened. And there is nothing left to do about it tonight. In the library, Dr. Samuels was advising against a post-mortem. There was no reason for one, he said. Mrs. Cavendish Price had a documented cardiac history. The death was consistent with that history. A post-mortem would be distressing and unnecessary. He could sign the certificate without difficulty. Sir Edmund looked at his hands. Robert looked at the doctor. Robert said, "Is that normal, without a post-mortem?" Samuels said it was perfectly normal in cases of this kind. He said it with a certain steadiness that came from long practice, and was not quite the same as conviction. Sir Edmund said, "Whatever Felix thinks is right," and looked at his hands again. Robert said nothing more. The certificate was agreed. Samuels wrote it in the hall before he left, using the writing table by the umbrella stand, and Perkins witnessed it, and Samuels put on his coat and said good-night to no one in particular, and let himself out. Robert stood at the library window watching Samuel's car lights move down the drive. His face in the glass was not the face of a man in straightforward grief. It was complicated, that face. There was grief in it, of the genuine kind, the kind that surprises you. But there was also something else, something less comfortable, which was the face of a man who had said things he could not now unsay, and who was wondering whether they would matter. They had quarrelled, he and his mother, that afternoon. 3 people had heard it, or parts of it. He had needed money, a specific sum, not outrageous but not small, and she had refused, and he had told her she was cruel, and she had told him he was irresponsible, and he had said, at the end, something he should not have said, and he knew it, and she had known it, and she was dead now, and he was the one who would remember it. He turned from the window. Constance Alford appeared in the library doorway, with a cup of tea for him, which she offered without comment. He took it. She went back to the drawing-room without fuss. In the drawing-room, Miss Marple watched her return and settle again into her chair. Constance picked up the cup she had set aside and drank from it. Her expression was one of appropriate sorrow, quietly borne. She looked at the fire, which had been lit because the evening had cooled slightly after midnight. Miss Marple looked at the fire as well. She was thinking, as she often thought at moments like this one, of someone she had known in St. Mary Mead, a woman called Gladys Hammersley, who had once lost a child and had worn her grief in exactly this way for 2 years, still and neat and entirely unprocessed, and had then had what the village called a breakdown, though breakdown seemed too small a word for what it had been. The grief had been real. The composure had been the problem. Constance Alford's composure was real, but the grief underneath it, Miss Marple thought, putting down a stitch, was not for Dorothea Cavendish Price. Chapter. Miss Marple stays. Another week, Patricia Vane said, at breakfast the next morning, that Miss Marple really must not think of leaving. Miss Marple said that she had no wish to be in the way at a time like this. Patricia said that was exactly why she must stay, because otherwise there would be nobody sensible, and Gerald was useless with grief. He always had been, and she needed someone to talk to. Miss Marple said she would stay another week. She helped herself to toast, and listened to the rain, which had begun some time before dawn, and was falling steadily on the kitchen garden and the stable yard and the lane outside. The heat wave had broken. "It's dreadful about Dorothea," Patricia said. She was 34, and had the kind of beauty that had peaked at 22, and was now settling into something more interesting. She was Gerald Vane's wife, and had been Patricia Forbes before that, and had spent 2 years in Italy in the 1930s, which she never quite got over. I know she was difficult. She was always difficult, but she was only 58, and to go like that, on the night of the ball, without any warning. It seems wrong, somehow. Death very often seems wrong, Miss Marple said, even when it is not. Patricia looked at her. What does that mean? Only that when we say a death seems wrong, we generally mean it seems untimely, which is a slightly different thing. Miss Marple put down her cup. Did Mrs. Cavendish Price have enemies? Genuine ones. I mean, not the sort one accumulates by being on too many committees. Patricia thought about it. Not enemies exactly. She was the sort of woman who left a long, thin mark on the world, people she'd crossed, decisions she'd made that didn't go well for someone else. Edmund's magistrate business, obviously, and she was firm about money. She and Robert had been going around and around about his allowance for months. "And Miss Alford?" Miss Marple said. "How long have they been friends?" "Oh, decades. School friends originally. Then they lost touch, and Constance wrote to her about 3 years ago, when she was widowed, and they started up again. This was her first proper visit, I think. It must have been a terrible welcome." Patricia looked at the rain. "Although Constance doesn't seem very terrible about it. She seems quite collected." "She is very collected," Miss Marple agreed. She spent the morning at Farnley Court, which Patricia's connection to the family made possible without awkwardness. Sir Edmund was closeted with his solicitor. Robert had gone out, walking in the rain. Helen Prout moved through the house with her usual efficiency, stripped now of her mistress's directions, slightly at a loss with the larger decisions, quite certain of the smaller ones. Miss Marple spoke to Helen in the kitchen passage at 11 o'clock. In what appeared to be a chance encounter, on her way to find a vase for the roses Patricia had sent over. It must have been very distressing, Miss Marple said, finding her like that. Helen Prout was 38, brown-haired, with the careful face of someone who has worked in good houses long enough to know when to display feeling and when not to. "It was Miss Marple," she said. She did not elaborate. "She had seemed well during the day?" "Yes, Miss Marple. She was busy, as you'd expect, with the preparations. She had her tea at 4. She was at her desk until 6. I did her hair at 7. A small pause. She seemed quite her usual self. And Dr. Samuels had been attending her for some time. 14 years. Helen said it, flatly, the way one states a fact one does not like. Then she seemed to hear something in her own voice and adjusted it. He was her regular doctor. She trusted him. "Of course," said Miss Marple. She found the vase and went on her way, and did not ask anything else. She spent half an hour in the east sitting room, which had a window onto the gravel drive, and another onto the back terrace, and which was more importantly a room she could sit in without appearing to do anything in particular except rest. She was 69, and her knees were not what they had been, and there was something to be said for a chair and a window on a rainy morning, she was thinking about Constance Alford. The composure was not, in itself, suspicious. Some people were composed by nature. Some people became composed by practice, after long difficulty. Widowhood did that. Long marriages to difficult men did that. But there were kinds of composure that were really only control. And the difference was in what happened around the edges. What happened around the edges of Constance Alford's composure was very nearly nothing. And that was the part that interested Miss Marple. She had watched Constance at breakfast. She had watched her speak to Robert briefly in the hall. She had watched her accept condolences from the vicar's wife, who had come over at 9 with a cake and a great deal of feeling. In every case, Constance's reaction was correct to the fraction of a degree, and not one fraction more. Grief for a lost old friend has some spill to it. It runs slightly over its banks. Constance Alford's grief did not spill anywhere. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. Outside the rain fell on the dry lawn and the dried-up flower borders, and soaked into everything that had been parched for 3 weeks. The garden looked relieved. She turned a heel and thought about composure and what it costs to maintain it. Chapter. The quarrel everyone heard Inspector Craddock arrived from Chipping Norton on the Thursday, 2 days after the death, driving himself and accompanied only by a constable he left in the car. He was 53, grey at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who has found that hurrying rarely improves things. He had been sent because the county coroner had asked a question. The coroner, a careful man named Henshaw who had been doing the job for 25 years, had read Dr. Samuel's certificate and noted the age of the deceased and had made a telephone call. The call was not accusatory. It was merely a question. Craddock came to see if the question needed answering. He spoke first to Sir Edmund, who was grieved and bemused and helpful in the way of men who have never had to think very hard about anything, because things have generally arranged themselves. He spoke to Robert, who was cooperative and taught in equal measure. He spoke to Dr. Samuels, who was helpful and precise and slightly too composed about it. Then he sat in the morning room with a cup of coffee and the notes he had gathered, and he looked at them. 3 people had heard the quarrel between Robert and his mother on the afternoon of the ball. The first was Perkins, who had been passing the closed door of the study at around 3:30, and had heard raised voices, which he had correctly attributed to the young master and his mother, since they had been going at it intermittently for months. He had not stopped. He had not heard specific words. The second was a parlour-maid named Sylvie, 18, recently come from the village, who had gone to the study door at 3:15 to ask about the table linen for the ballroom, and had heard, clearly through the door, "You have never once in your life thought about anyone but yourself," spoken in a man's voice which she had recognised as Mr. Roberts. She had not knocked, she had gone away. The third account came from Constance Alford, who told Craddock, quietly and without drama, that she had been in the morning room adjacent to the study at some point between 3 and 4 and had heard the study door open, suddenly. Robert had come out into the corridor and stood there for a moment. She had not been able to see him from where she sat. She had heard him say, "Then I'll wait," and then the door had closed again, hard, and she had heard footsteps going up the stairs. Craddock made a note. "I'll wait." He was not sure what it meant. He was not sure it meant anything. But he wrote it down. He went next to find Robert. Robert Cavendish Price was in the library, not reading a book that was open on his knee. He was 29, and had his father's height and his mother's mouth, the tight, particular set of it, and he looked as though he had not slept much. "You argued with your mother on the afternoon she died," Craddock said. He did not frame it as a question. "We did," Robert said. "I needed money." She said no. I was unpleasant about it. I wish I hadn't been. "How much money?" £800. There are debts. From Nairobi. She knew about them in general. She didn't know the specifics, and she didn't want to. "What did you say to her?" "The unpleasant part." Robert looked at the window. Outside the rain had stopped and the garden was dripping. I said she was the reason my father was the way he was. That she had spent 30 years making everyone around her smaller so that she could stay the right size. He paused. I said some other things as well. None of them were as well put as that. And she said I was a disappointment. He said it without particular expression, and that she would consider the money, which was her way of ending the conversation. Craddock wrote that down too. He had Robert's measure now, or thought he had. The guilt was real. The guilt was about what had been said, not about what had been done. That was a different quality of guilt, and Craddock, who had spent 30 years with both kinds, could generally tell them apart, but the inheritance was fact. Robert would get the house, or a share of it, and a trust, and a good deal of Dorothea's personal estate. And the debts were £800, which was not nothing, and he had been overheard saying, "I'll wait." Craddock did not arrest Robert. He did not think it was quite time to arrest Robert, but he left Farnley Court. That afternoon, with Robert at the front of his mind, and the other names arranged behind him, like figures in a queue, whose number had not yet been called, he stopped on the way to his car to see Miss Marple, who was walking in the garden with Patricia Vane. Patricia introduced them. Craddock, who knew Marple's name from 2 previous occasions on which her name had come up in county discussions of solved cases, was respectful without being sycophantic. "Difficult business," he said. "Very," said Miss Marple. "That young man is not a murderer, Inspector." Craddock looked at her. "You sound quite certain." "I am quite certain," she said, "about the young man." She paused. "I am less certain about other things as yet." She looked past him at the house. "Dr. Samuels was in some haste to certify the death, I think." "He was," Craddock said. He studied her. "Is that interesting to you?" "It's interesting in the way that wrong things are always interesting," she said. "It may have a perfectly good explanation." Craddock said he would look into it. He got in his car and drove away. Chapter. Something in the dressing-table Patricia was the one who suggested it, on the Friday morning, which was 4 days after the death, and 2 days after Craddock's visit, she said. Miss Marple ought to see the room, that Dorothea would not have minded, that she herself could not face it alone, so they went together, Patricia and Miss Marple and Helen Prout, who had the key, and who opened the door and stood to one side and did not go in. The bedroom was large and south-facing, and smelled of the particular mixture of good soap and old wood that large country house bedrooms accumulate over decades. The windows had been opened and the air moved through. Someone had been in to tidy. The bed was made. The surfaces clear. A bunch of late garden flowers in a vase on the chest of drawers. The dressing room was through a connecting door. Smaller, north-facing, with a single window that looked onto the stable yard. A dressing table with a triptych mirror. A chair, a clothes press, a narrow wardrobe. The chair was against the dressing table, exactly as it had been when Helen had found her mistress on the floor. Patricia stood in the connecting doorway and did not come further in. Miss Marple went to the dressing table. It was orderly, as a woman like Dorothea Cavendish Price's dressing table would be. A silver-backed brush set, the kind bought in the 1920s and used ever since. A cut-glass tray with powder, rouge, a small bottle of scent. On the left side, a white porcelain pot with a pale cream in it, the lid set beside it rather than on it. Someone had looked inside. The pot was perhaps 3/4 full. "What is that?" Miss Marple asked, indicating the pot. Helen answered from the doorway, where she had come to stand without entering. "Her night cream, Miss Marple. She used it every evening." "The same brand for many years?" Helen paused. "She changed to this one some years ago. It's called Satin Touch. She liked it." "And Miss Alford," Miss Marple said, conversationally, turning the pot in her hands and reading the label. "Has she been using the dressing room at all during her stay? Women sometimes borrow a room for a moment when there's something needed." "Not that I know of," Helen said. "Then Miss Alford's room has its own facilities, Miss Marple. She wouldn't have needed to come in here. No, said Miss Marple. No, of course not. She set the pot down in its place. She looked at the arrangement of things on the dressing table. The position of the brush set. The distance of the scent bottle from the mirror. The small drawer on the right side, half an inch open. She did not open it further. She looked at the floor. The carpet was good wool, a faded pink, and it showed the impression of a dressing table chair pushed back in haste. A slight flattening at 2 points where the chair legs had dragged, not the measured movement of someone getting up after finishing, the sudden movement of someone who had felt unwell very quickly. She looked at the chair again, at the table, at the cream. An accumulation. That was what hyoscine did if you used it that way. Not one dose large enough to be crude. A series of doses small, enough to be absorbed through the skin over several nights, building toward the point at which the heart, pressed by heat and excitement and champagne, simply gave way. She did not know for certain that it was hyoscine. She did not know for certain that it was anything. She thought about what she knew, which was this. The cream had been there, accessible, for the 3 nights of Constance Alford's stay. The room connecting the bedroom to the dressing room had no lock. The house was busy with ball preparations, servants occupied elsewhere. 3 minutes would have done it, but she had no proof of any of this. She had a pot of cream and an impression in a carpet and a woman downstairs whose composure was wrong in a specific way. She was not found on the floor by the chair, Miss Marple said. Helen looked at her. Helen, you told Inspector Craddock she was found with her arm outstretched toward the dressing table leg. That is here. She pointed to a spot some 2 feet from the chair. But the chair marks are there. She moved or fell from the chair and then moved further, or was not sitting when it took her. Helen stared at the carpet. She said, slowly, She was on the floor when I came in. I didn't think about how she'd got there. No, said Miss Marple gently. One doesn't, at a moment like that. She took one more look at the room, and then went back through the connecting door, and Patricia, who had been watching her from the doorway, said, Jane, what are you thinking? I am thinking, said Miss Marple, that I would like to take tea with Miss Alford this afternoon. Would that be possible, do you think? Chapter. The pressed flowers. The tea was arranged with no difficulty. Constance Alford was still at Farndley Court, where she had taken on the quiet, necessary work of helping Sir Edmund's household run. She had spoken to Perkins about the luncheon arrangements. She had answered 3 letters of condolence on Sir Edmund's behalf, because he could not face them yet. She had been useful, which was a way of occupying a position in a house where one's position was otherwise uncertain. She and Miss Marple took their tea in the morning room at 4 o'clock. The rain had returned. The window looked onto the terrace and the lawn beyond it, both wet and gleaming. Constance poured. Her hands were steady. She had strong, capable hands, not pretty hands, and she wore no jewellery except a plain wedding ring, the gold worn quite thin. Miss Marple took her cup and said, You and Dorothea were at school together. Fernwood, was it? Fernwood, yes, Constance said. In Surrey. We were there from 1909 to 1913. It must be strange, Miss Marple said, to renew an old friendship after so long. 3 years, you said. Did you find her much changed? Constance considered it with what seemed like genuine attention. In some ways. She had the same quality she always had, that certainty about things. Dorothea always knew the right way to do everything, even at 16. Whether she was right about it didn't seem to affect her confidence. A slight pause. She was less unkind than she had been as a girl, I think. Or more careful about it. Renewed friendships are curious things, Miss Marple said. Sometimes one finds that one never really knew the person at all. One knew the surface of them at a particular age, and then one meets a stranger who happens to have the same name. She paused. Did you find Dorothea a stranger this time? Constance was quiet for a moment. Somewhat, she said. Yes. Miss Marple admired the morning room in a general way, mentioned the arrangements for the flowers, asked whether Constance was comfortable in her room. Very comfortable, Constance said. It's a pleasant room. The view is onto the kitchen garden, which I like. There is an apple tree. Did you bring your books? I always bring books and never read them. A few. A slight warmth in the voice. I brought a Siegfried Sassoon I've been meaning to get to, and a small poetry anthology. I've had it for years. Miss Marple said she had never much got on with Sassoon. She preferred simpler things, she said, old hymns, verses she had learned as a girl. She mentioned 2 or 3 by name. She was watching Constance's face with the patient, unobtrusive attention of a woman who has spent many years watching people's faces in situations far less charged than this one. The next afternoon, Miss Marple asked if she might borrow a book. She named no title. She said only that Patricia's bookshelves at Charlbury House ran heavily to field sports, and she was in need of something else. Constance said, of course, and took her upstairs. Constance's room was exactly as described. South onto the kitchen garden, an apple tree visible through the window, bare now, its last apples harvested. The room was kept neatly, a small case open on the luggage stand, clothes inside it folded, a book on the bedside table, spine upward, the Sassoon, on the windowsill, set in the light, an anthology of verse, small and brown, pages soft with use. Constance went to the bedside table to find something she thought Miss Marple might like. Miss Marple went to the windowsill. The anthology lay open, not from being read, but as though it had been left open deliberately, at a particular poem, a short poem, 7 stanzas concerning loss and patience. Miss Marple did not read it closely. She looked at what was between the pages, pressed flat and dried. A small bunch of white Michaelmas daisies, 3 of them dried completely, their petals brittle and still, and in the margin beside the poem's 3rd stanza, in pencil, a date, October 1934. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. She picked up the book carefully and felt the weight of the dried flowers inside it, and set it down. October 1934. She was not sure of the exact date of Gerald Alford's conviction. She would find out. But the month felt right for a verdict. Late autumn, when things are put away, Constance came back with a trollop she thought Miss Marple might enjoy, and found her by the window, looking at the apple tree. I find bare trees more interesting than full ones, Miss Marple said. You can see the shape of them. She borrowed the trollop and went away. That evening she sat with Patricia and said, "Do you know anything about a solicitor named Gerald Alford? From Gloucestershire?" Patricia said she didn't. She asked Gerald Vane at dinner, and he said the name meant nothing, but that he knew a man in Cheltenham who might know. Miss Marple said she would be grateful for his name. She went to bed at 9 and lay awake in the particular darkness of the country. No street lamps, no traffic, only the settling of the house, and once the call of an owl in the apple trees somewhere, near the kitchen garden, where Constance Alford lay in her neat, prepared room. October 1934. Michaelmas daisies in autumn. They were the right flower for it, if you were the sort of person who pressed flowers for reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment. They lasted well. They kept their shape. They were the colour of something finished. Those white petals, dry and fragile, and perfectly preserved. In St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had known a woman called Edna Fitch, who had kept a pressed violet for 11 years, in a letter she had never sent. And when they had found the letter after she died, nobody could work out what the violet was for. Miss Marple had thought she understood. Some griefs are pressed and kept for the same reason anything is pressed and kept, because you are not finished with them. Constance Alford had been keeping this one for 26 years. Chapter. Gerald Alford. Gerald Vane's man in Cheltenham was a retired solicitor named Poulter, who was 70 and had a memory for professional cases, the way other men have a memory for cricket. Scores. Miss Marple wrote him a short letter on the Saturday morning, explaining that she was trying to trace some background on a man named Gerald Alford, a solicitor, who had practised in Gloucestershire until about 1938 and had died, she believed, sometime in the late 1940s. She gave Patricia's address. The reply came on Monday by first post. It was 2 pages, neat and precise, and contained everything Miss Marple needed, and one thing she had not expected. Gerald Alford had been a solicitor in Cirencester from 1922 to 1934, specialising in land and property. He had developed a respectable practice and was considered competent and honest by those who knew him professionally. In October 1934, he had been convicted of fraud, specifically of forging a land deed in connection with a property dispute between 2 farming families, the Siddons and the Reardon families, over a parcel of hill pasture in the Cotswolds. The principal witness against him had been a woman named Dorothea Fenwick, now Dorothea Cavendish Price, who had been called to give evidence regarding a document she claimed to have seen Alford produce and alter in her presence. Her testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Alford had maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He had been convicted and sentenced to 4 years. He had served the full term, been disbarred, and practised briefly as a land agent after his release. He died in February 1949 of pneumonia. That much Miss Marple had expected. The thing she had not expected was in the second page of Poulter's letter. A clerk named Donald Sims had been employed by a Cheltenham firm that had handled a related property matter in 1935 during the appeal process. Poulter had known Sims slightly. Sims had, late in his life, made a statement to Poulter, which Poulter was not sure what to do with and had written down and kept. The statement was this. Sims had, in 1935, seen a letter. The letter was from Dorothea Cavendish Price, to a man connected with the Reardon family, written before the trial. In the letter, she had indicated that she would give evidence as to the altered document, and that her evidence would be clear and decisive. The phrasing of the letter suggested she had determined what she would say before she had been formally interviewed by the prosecution. In short, Dora Cavendish Price had decided to destroy Gerald Alford before the trial. Her testimony had not been a witness's honest recollection. It had been an intention formed in advance. Sims had died in 1958. The letter, if it still existed, was somewhere in a box of old Reardon papers that Poulter believed had been given to a nephew in Worcestershire. Miss Marple folded the letter. She sat with it for a few minutes, and thought about a woman who had decided, at some point before October 1934, to ruin a man. She thought about why such a decision would be made. The property dispute would have involved the Cavendish Price family's land interests, or the interests of someone connected to them. Dorothea had been born Dorothea Fenwick, and the Fenwicks had land in that part of Gloucestershire. The Reardon family had presumably been on the Fenwick side. Alford had been on the Siddons side. A solicitor, who had genuinely altered a document, would have been guilty and justly convicted. A solicitor who had not, and who had been convicted on the strength of predetermined testimony, had been destroyed for the sake of someone else's land. He had served 4 years. He had come out broken. He had died at 51 of pneumonia, which is what men die of when their resistance is gone. His wife had been Constance Alford, née Vickers. She had lived on for 11 years after his death. She had, approximately 3 years ago, renewed a friendship with Dorothea Cavendish Price. Miss Marple thought, a deathbed confession. Some clerk, some secondary figure, had told Constance what he knew, and Constance had known. Then, what she had perhaps suspected but not been certain of, which was that her husband had been innocent, and that Dorothea had known he was innocent when she spoke against him. What does a woman do with that knowledge at 54 or 55? A widow herself by then, her husband 12 or 13 years dead. She keeps it. She presses it flat like a flower, like a date penciled in a margin. She waits. Miss Marple put the letter in her bag. She would need Craddock. She was not quite ready for Craddock. There were still 2 things she needed to confirm, and one of them she would have to manage herself. Chapter. Helen and the notebook Craddock came back to Farnley Court on the Tuesday, which was a week after the death. He came for Robert, which everyone expected, and he spent an hour with Robert in the library, going again over the quarrel and the money and the inheritance. Robert was patient and truthful, and looked as though patience was costing him a great deal. Craddock had arranged, without stating why, to speak also to Helen Prout. He did this in the housekeeper's sitting room, a small room off the main passage on the ground floor with a window onto the kitchen yard. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bennet, was elsewhere. Helen came in and sat down and folded her hands and looked at Craddock with the face she kept for difficult moments. She had known this was coming. She was a careful woman, and she had run the numbers, and she knew that when a death is looked into, the accounts get looked at too. Mrs. Cavendish Price had been keeping a closer eye on the household accounts this past month, Craddock said. He had been given access to the ledgers by Sir Edmund, who had not fully registered the implication. She liked to keep track, Helen said. She found an irregularity. He said it without emphasis. Several irregularities, over approximately 2 years. Small amounts. £40 in total, perhaps a little more. Helen looked at the window. Yes. She had spoken to you about it. On the Tuesday before the ball. She told me she had found it, and she was deciding what to do about it. Helen's voice was steady. She said she would speak to Sir Edmund and to the solicitor after the ball. She thought it ought to be handled formally. And after her death, you destroyed a notebook. A silence. Helen said, a small notebook where I had kept track of my own figures. I knew how it would look. It looked, Craddock said, as though you were concealing evidence. I know it did. Craddock looked at her for a long moment. He had been doing this job for 30 years, and he knew the difference, most of the time, between a woman concealing guilt and a woman concealing a smaller, separate thing. Helen Prout was concealing the smaller thing. The guilt was real, but it was the guilt of a thief, not of a murderer, and those were different guilts that sat differently in the body. You went to the dressing room at 7 o'clock that evening, Craddock said. To do her hair, yes. And you left at approximately 7:15? 7:20, maybe a little after. And you came back at 8:20 for the gloves? Yes. In the hour between, did anyone else go to the dressing room? Helen considered. I can't say for certain. The house was very busy. There were people coming and going on the first-floor corridor all evening. Guests going to their rooms to change. The footmen taking hot water up. She paused. I didn't see anyone go specifically to her dressing room. Miss Alford's room is on the same corridor. Yes. 3 doors along. Craddock noted this and said nothing more on the subject. He told Helen that the matter of the accounts would be referred to Sir Edmund, and that it was not, for the present, his primary concern. He said she should not leave the area without informing him. Helen went back to her duties. Craddock stood in the housekeeper's sitting room and looked at his notes. He was not as certain as he had been a week ago that Robert Cavendish Price was his man. Robert's guilt was the guilt of a bad conversation with his mother, of debts and sharpness, and I'll wait. And it didn't have the right weight to it for the other kind. The question of the post-mortem was still pressing. Samuel's certificate was legally sufficient, but it was thin. Craddock had been in contact with the coroner again. Henshaw, the careful man, had said that if there was sufficient reason, he could order one. Craddock did not yet have sufficient reason. He had a dead woman certified as heart failure, a son who had quarrelled with her, a lady's maid who had stolen from her, a doctor who had certified her death with perhaps unnecessary speed, and a visiting old-school friend who was a widow with no obvious stake in anything. He went out to his car and sat in it and thought. Miss Marple appeared at the passenger window, which made him start slightly. I am sorry to accost you in the drive, she said. Would you have a moment? He got out of the car. She was wearing her good coat and her second-best hat, which meant she had been somewhere today, or intended to go somewhere. She said, I need to confirm one thing before I speak to you properly. I will be ready to speak to you by Thursday. Are you available on Thursday? Craddock said he was. I will telephone Patricia Vane's house, she said. She looked at him steadily. I think you should begin to consider a post-mortem, Inspector. She went back toward the house before he could answer. Chapter: The Wrong Season. The chemist was in Chipping Norton, a small shop on the market street that had been there since at least 1890 and smelled correctly of camphor and new soap. The proprietor was a Mr. Finch, 50 or so, precise and quietly helpful in the way of men who have given their professional lives to accuracy. Miss Marple was in Chipping Norton on the Wednesday, because Patricia needed something from the draper, and because Miss Marple had found, over many years, that the most efficient way to get to a chemist is to happen to be near one. She examined various items for a few minutes, purchased a tin of lozenges she didn't particularly need, and then asked, in the conversational way of someone with time on her hands, about face creams. She said her niece had recommended a particular one, that she had seen it in a friend's dressing room, and wondered if Mr. Finch stocked it. It's called Satin Touch, she said. A night cream, in a white pot. Finch said yes, he stocked it. It was a good product, he said, introduced about 15 or 16 years ago. Quite popular with a certain kind of customer. 15 years, Miss Marple said. So relatively recent. My friend said she'd been using it for years, but I wondered if she meant it. Women always say that about creams they like. Finch smiled professionally and said he thought it had come in around 1931 or perhaps 1932. It had been a new formulation from the manufacturer, replacing an older product. He could check his records if she needed the exact date, though he thought 1931 was right. Miss Marple said that was very kind, and she didn't need the exact date. And she bought a small pot of the cream she didn't need either, and thanked him, and went back to find Patricia at the draper's, 1931. Constance Alford had mentioned, at their first meeting, Dorothea's Friday routine, her nightly cold cream, the particular brand, applied always before bed. She had said it was something she remembered from school, that Dorothea had always been particular about her skin. They had left Fernwood School in 1913. The cream had been introduced in 1931. Constance knew about the Satin Touch cream because she had handled it during her stay at Farnley Court. She knew about it because she had opened the pot. She had said the first thing that came to mind to account for her knowledge, which was the school. And it had been the wrong thing, because the school was too early by 18 years. This was the kind of mistake, Miss Marple thought, that is made not in preparation but in the moment, when a question comes slightly from an unexpected direction, and the answer goes to the first available source. The school was the available source. Constance had lived with this plan for long enough that its origins were tangled, and she had pulled on the wrong thread. On Thursday morning, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock. She said, "There are 3 things I want to tell you, Inspector. And then there is a thing I would like to do this afternoon with your knowledge, if not your presence." Craddock said he was listening. She told him about the cream and the date. She told him about Gerald Alford and Poulter's letter, which she had in her bag. She told him about October 1934 and the penciled date in the margin of the anthology. Craddock was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're suggesting, Mrs. Alford altered the cream. I'm suggesting it is possible. I am also suggesting that if you can obtain a post-mortem now, before more time passes, the traces of any foreign substance may still be present in Mrs. Cavendish Price's tissues. Hyoscine, particularly, I believe, can be detected for some time." "Where did you learn about hyoscine?" "From a book," Miss Marple said, which was true. "I read a great deal." There was another pause. Craddock said, "What is it you want to do this afternoon?" she told him. He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "Miss Marple, if she is the woman you think she is, you should not be alone with her." "I won't be alone with her," she said. "I will be having tea." In the morning room, with the door open and Perkins in the hall, who is a large man. "And I am not going to ask her anything that would make her dangerous. I am going to say one specific thing and watch what happens. Craddock said. "Ring me when it's done." "I will ring you when it's done," she said, and thanked him, and went to find Constance Alford. Chapter. Hot water. On a Wednesday, Perkins did not know why Miss Marple had asked him to remain in the hall rather than in the kitchen passage where he generally spent his afternoons. He was a man of considerable discretion and asked no questions. He found a reason to polish the hall table and remained there. The morning room door was open 4 inches. Constance and Miss Marple took their tea at 3:30. The room was warmer today, the weak November sun coming through the west-facing window and lying across the carpet. Constance sat, as she always sat, with her back to it. Miss Marple sat in the chair where the light was good. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, about Sir Edmund, who was managing better than expected, about Robert, who had gone to London for 2 days and was expected back Friday, about the letters of condolence, which kept arriving, 20 or 30 a day, from everyone Dorothea had ever sat on a committee with, which was a great number. Miss Marple put down her cup and said, in a conversational tone, "Inspector Craddock spoke to me this morning." Constance said, "Oh, he has found a witness." One of the parlour maids, apparently. "She says she saw someone at Dorothea's dressing table on the Wednesday evening." Miss Marple picked up her cup again. "He seems to think it may be significant." There was a pause of precisely the kind that Miss Marple had been waiting for. Constance said, "She was off on Wednesday." She said it with the certainty of a woman reaching for a fact she knew well. "The parlour maid. I remember quite clearly, because I asked for hot water that evening, and had to ring twice and wait some time. They were short-staffed. She was off." She stopped. Miss Marple put her cup down again, very carefully. She was looking at the window. She said, "The young girl who is usually on the first-floor corridor in the evenings?" Constance said, "Yes." And then she heard it, the echo of what she had just said, and she was still. The room was very quiet. Outside in the hall, the sound of cloth on wood, Perkins at the table. Miss Marple did not look at Constance. She looked at the garden, the wet lawn, the bare rose beds. She said, in the same conversational tone, "How long did you plan it?" After a moment, Constance said, "A long time. Since Sims told you." The slightest intake of breath. Since Sims. A pause. "You know about Sims." "I know about Gerald," Miss Marple said. "I know about October 1934. I know about the letter Dorothea wrote before the trial." She paused. "I am sorry about your husband, Mrs. Alford. Genuinely." Constance was looking at the window now, too. Her hands were in her lap, folded as they always were, quite still. "He was a good man," she said. "He was an entirely ordinary, decent, good man. He did not do what she said he did." She paused. "When Sims told me, I was angry for about a year. Just angry. And then the anger went somewhere else. It became something else. I don't know the right word for it." "Patience," Miss Marple said quietly. "The bad kind." Constance looked at her. For a moment her face was the first unguarded face Miss Marple had seen from her. It had a great deal in it, that face, most of which was very old. "Yes," she said, "that. You renewed the friendship. I wrote to her, when I knew what she had done. I thought at first I might confront her, make her admit it. But she would never have admitted it. She didn't know how." Constance looked back at the window, and then I thought about what else I might do, with 3 years or 5 years, or however long she had, and with access to her house and her room and her ordinary evenings. A long pause. The cream was her habit. She never varied it. Not once in 3 nights did she vary it. Miss Marple said nothing. "I did not think about this afternoon," Constance said. "I thought about Gerald, about the 4 years, about him coming home and not being himself any longer, about the pneumonia." She was quite composed again now. It was a different kind of composure from before, not the careful, managed kind. The composure of someone who has finished. "I thought it would feel like something when it was done. It didn't particularly." "No," said Miss Marple, "it rarely does." She looked at the older woman across the tea table. and felt the complicated thing that she always felt in these moments, which was not precisely pity and not precisely condemnation, and was composed of both in proportions that shifted. Dorothea Cavendish Price had been guilty of a real crime, and had paid no price for it in 26 years. Her husband had been innocent and had paid for it with his health and his career, and finally, with the pneumonia that finished him off. These were facts. They did not make what Constance had done right. Miss Marple knew this. She had always known it. She said, "I am going to ring Inspector Craddock now. I think it would be better if you remained here. You may finish your tea." She got up steadily and went to the door and into the hall. Perkins was at the table. He looked at her face and straightened and said nothing. She telephoned from the study, which had a door she could close. Craddock answered on the second ring. She said, "You should come this afternoon, Inspector. I have done what I needed to do." She went back to the morning room. Constance was sitting exactly where she had been, her hands folded, her tea unfinished, looking at the November garden. She did not try to leave. Miss Marple had not thought she would. Chapter. Inspector Craddock's afternoon. Craddock arrived at Farnley Court at 5 o'clock. He had brought the constable from the car, and a woman sergeant from Chipping Norton. He had also, in the 2 hours between Miss Marple's telephone call and his arrival, set two things in motion: the post-mortem and a conversation with the Home Office pathologist, who had been on standby since Henshaw the coroner had begun asking questions a week ago. He found Miss Marple in the hall. She handed him, without preamble, a folded letter and said, "This is from a retired solicitor named Poulter in Cheltenham. It concerns Gerald Alford's conviction in 1934 and the testimony given against him by the deceased. I think you will find it useful background." She paused. "Mrs. Alford is in the morning room. She has not moved. I told her to remain there, and she has." Craddock read the first page of the letter quickly, then the second. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. "You're certain about the cream?" The brand was introduced in 1931. Mrs. Alford knew it by name and habit in a way that could only come from handling it during this visit, she said. She remembered it from school days, and that is impossible. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "The post-mortem will find what it finds, Inspector, but when it finds it, you will know what it means." He thanked her. He went down the hall to the morning room. Constance Alford was sitting by the window, her tea cold on the table beside her, watching the dusk come down over the lawn. She looked up when Craddock came in, and her expression was the expression of someone who has already done everything they are going to do, for good or ill, and is now simply waiting, he said in his careful way. "Mrs. Alford, I need to ask you some questions. You don't have to say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence." Constance said, "I understand." She answered his questions for 40 minutes. She was precise and complete, and she did not equivocate. She described the cream, the 3 nights, the dosage she had calculated from a pharmacological text she had obtained from a library in Gloucester 9 months before, under a false name. She described the acquisition of the hyoscine, which had required 2 separate approaches in 2 different counties, using prescriptions obtained through means she explained without being asked. She described standing in Dorothea's dressing room at 11 o'clock on the Wednesday night, when the house was quiet, and working quickly and without a light, which she did not need because she had been in the room in daylight 3 times and knew where everything was. She said, at the end, "I would like to write to Sir Edmund, not to explain myself, to tell him that it was nothing he did, and nothing Robert did, and nothing about the house or the family. It was between Dorothea and me, and it had been between us for a very long time." Craddock said he would see what he could arrange. The arrest was made at 5:30. The woman sergeant was present throughout. Constance put on her coat herself, the good navy coat, and picked up her handbag, and walked to the car with the bearing of a woman who has been preparing for this moment and finds it, now that it is here, almost a relief. The results of the post-mortem came back 11 days later. The pathologist found hyoscine hydrobromide in the body tissue at a level consistent with repeated topical application over 3 to 4 nights. He also found it in the cold cream, which had been retained when the case was formally opened. The concentration in the cream was measured, and the chemistry confirmed what Constance had described. The arrest was reported in the local paper. The article credited the Oxford Constabulary under Inspector Craddock with an investigation that had quickly moved beyond the initial verdict of natural causes and uncovered a carefully planned and executed poisoning. The name of Miss Marple did not appear. There was no reason it should. Craddock closed the file on the Wednesday evening, and he sat for a while in his office in Chipping Norton and thought about Gerald Alford, who had died of pneumonia in 1949, and about the kind of patience it takes to wait 11 years after your husband's death and 26 years after the original injury, and then to act. He thought about Dorothea Cavendish Price, who had apparently spent 26 years not thinking about it at all. He put the file away and went home. Chapter. What the newspaper said. The Oxfordshire Courier ran the story on a Thursday 5 paragraphs on page 3, beneath an item about the County Council's plans for a new road. The headline was, "Hunt Ball Death, Woman Charged with Murder at Funley Court." The article named Constance Eleanor Alford, widow of Cheltenham, and described her as an acquaintance of the deceased. It named Inspector Craddock and the constabulary, and described the investigation as thorough and swift. It did not mention the post-mortem delay, or the initial certificate, or the fact that Dr. Samuels had since been spoken to at some length by the General Medical Council. Sir Edmund read it at breakfast, alone, because Robert was in London again, and would not be back until the following week. He read it twice, and then put it face down on the table, and poured himself more coffee, which he did not drink. He was 61, and he had been married to Dorothea for 32 years, and he had spent most of those years at a slight distance from her, as men do with women who run things better than they do. He had been fond of her in the particular way of men who are fond of order and efficiencies, and who confuse those things with love. He was not sure, since her death, whether what he felt was grief for Dorothea, or grief for the shape of his days, which had been organised around her without his noticing. He thought about Constance Alford, and what she had done, and could not make himself feel simple about it. He put the newspaper in the wastepaper basket, and went out to see about the horses. Robert read the story on Friday in London, in a newspaper he bought at the Paddington bookstall before catching his train home. He stood on the platform and read it through twice, and then stood there for another minute, missing the train, and caught the next one. He thought about his mother on the floor of the dressing room. He thought about the quarrel. He thought about the fact that his mother had, apparently, done a terrible thing 26 years ago, and that the woman she had done it to had come to her house as a guest and killed her in her own dressing room on the night of her ball. He could not make this into a simple story. He tried to, on the train home through the wet Oxfordshire countryside, and could not. He arrived at Farnley Court at 7:30, and found his father in the library. They sat for an hour together, and said very little of any use, which was what they had generally done when things were difficult. And it was, Miss Marple would have thought, entirely typical of both of them. Helen Prout read the article in the kitchen on Friday morning. She read it quickly and folded the paper and gave it back to Perkins. She went on with the morning's work. The breakfast trays, the linen inventory, the arrangements for Sir Edmund's lunch. There was a great deal to do in a house whose mistress had been murdered. More, in some ways, than when the mistress had simply been present. Because the decisions that Dorothea would have made now defaulted to Perkins and to Helen herself, and someone had to make them. She was not mentioned in the article. She had not expected to be. Sir Edmund, in the end, did not pursue the matter of the accounts. She found out on the following Tuesday when he called her into the library and said in a vague, uncomfortable way that he had looked over the books and thought there were probably one or two things that could be tidied up, and that he would be grateful if she would stay on through the new year, when they would have a clearer idea of what was going to happen with the house. She said, "Yes, Sir Edmund," and went back to her work. At Charlbury House, 3 miles away, Miss Marple read the article over her second cup of tea, made a brief sound of satisfaction at the 3rd paragraph, and set the paper aside. Patricia said, "Are you pleased?" "Pleased is the wrong word," Miss Marple said. "The right word is something less comfortable. It was the right outcome. That is not the same as being pleased." She picked up her knitting, the pale blue, which was nearly finished. Outside the window, the November garden was bare and grey, and the apple trees stood in the orchard with their arms out, empty. She turned the last few rows and thought about Gerald Alford, whom she had never met, and about the kind of accounting that 26 years is, and about what it costs a person to be patient for that long, and what it does to them, and whether it is ever worth it. She thought it was not. She had thought so before. She would go on thinking so. But she understood the arithmetic of it. That was the trouble with understanding things. The knitting was finished.